It's astonishing. All this is only 20 or 30 minutes from the heart of San Francisco. Not a human habitation in sight anywhere. I've been living out here for some months to write and to absorb an atmosphere that is different from the city, to try and find out what is the essential difference between the world of nature and the world of man. Because there's an obvious difference, like the difference of artistic styles, between the things that human beings do and the things that nature does, even though human beings are themselves part of nature. On the one hand, nature is wiggly. Everything wiggles. The outlines of the hills, the shapes of the trees, the way the wind brushes the grass, the clouds, the tracks of streams. It all wiggles. And for some reason or other, we find wiggly things very difficult to keep track of. Human beings are just as wiggly as nature, and our brains are an incredible mess of wiggles. And that's the part of ourselves that we understand least of all. Each one of us, not only human beings, but every leaf, every weed, exists in the way it does only because everything else around it does. In other words, there's a relationship between the center and the circumference, which is rather like the relationship between the poles of a magnet. Without the center, no circumference. Without the circumference, no center. And although we say of poles that they're the poles apart, that is to say, extremely different, there's something between them, just as the north and south poles of a magnet are united by the magnet. So the individual and the universe are inseparable. But the curious thing is that while that's rather easy to see in theory, very few people are aware of it in an important, strong way, like one is aware of blue in blue sky or of the heat in fire. It's more of an idea than it is of a realization.
I suppose most of you have heard of Zen. But before going on to explain any details about it, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. I am not a Zen Buddhist. I am not advocating Zen Buddhism. I'm not trying to convert anyone to it. I have nothing to sell. I'm an entertainer. That is to say, in the same sense that when you go to a concert and you listen to someone play Mozart, he has nothing to sell except the sound of the music. He doesn't want to convert you to anything. He doesn't want you to join an organization in favor of Mozart's music as opposed to, say, Beethoven's. And I approach you in the same spirit as a musician with his piano or a violinist with his violin. I just want you to enjoy a point of view which I enjoy.
appelé Vallejo. Une rencontre, le philosophe Alan Watts.
Alan Watts, comment peut-on vous définir?
How do you bite your own teeth? Really, I don't know who I
Je
am.
ne sais vraiment pas qui je suis.
Because
Je pense que
I
chacun
do
d'entre nous
feel
représente
that every one of us,
fondamentalement
basically,
l'énergie de
the
tout
energy of the
l'univers.
whole universe. We had a false sense of our own identity. That we experienced ourselves. My mother had a big collection of Chinese art. This room is surrounded with parts of her collection of Chinese embroidery. And so as a child, I was fascinated with this art which was different from our art. It had a different view of nature, different way of looking at flowers and trees and water and birds and butterflies and people. So as a child, I was fascinated. Now, it so came about that when I was about 10 to 11 years old, I began to read thriller or mystery stories written by such people as Edgar Wallace and Sax Rohmer about sinister Chinese villains. You remember Dr. Fu Manchu? And there were all sorts of others like that. Strange, exotic figures who kept knives in their sleeves, who had ivory boxes full of the strangest poisons, but at the same time who had a kind of urbanity. And whereas other children at that time of life wanted, when they grew up, to become engineers driving trains, or sports car champions, or whatever it was, I wanted to become a Chinese villain. And so, just as every child at that time of life decorates their room with the things they're interested in, I became fascinated with the forms and the feeling of Chinese and Japanese art. And I still can't quite explain what it is, but it caught me. When I was a small boy, I used to haunt that section of London around the British Museum. And one day I came across a shop which had a notice over the window which said philosophical instruments. Even as a boy, I knew something about philosophy, but I couldn't imagine what philosophical instruments could be. So I went up to the window, and there displayed were chronometers, slide rules, scales, and all kinds of what we would now call scientific instruments, because science used to be called natural philosophy. Because, as Aristotle says, the beginning of philosophy is wonder. Philosophy is man's expression of curiosity about everything, his attempt to make sense of the world primarily through his intellect. That is to say, his faculty for thinking. I was at that time in school at Canterbury, right under the shadow of the cathedral, which is the center of the Church of England.
But that wasn't my religion. And so at the age of 15, I announced in the midst of this great cathedral that I was a Buddhist. And the British are very tolerant of eccentricity. They said, "Jolly what, the man's a Buddhist." Of course, subsequently, in the light of Buddhism, in the light of Hinduism, I restudied Christianity and found it wasn't at all the sort of thing that had been presented to me as a boy. I found that out later, and so for a while became an Anglican priest. But in those days, being an Anglican priest somehow was not my proper role. So I just had to decide to go it alone and do my own thing. Of course, the knowledge of Eastern methods and ideas in the West is not much older than 100 years. I hesitate, therefore, to predict what course they will take. It's like you thought that something out there was a flat disk and you suddenly discovered it was a ball. And so we're only just watching the beginnings of these influences.
I should perhaps say how my interest in calligraphy started. There was a well-known Japanese painter called Saburo Hasegawa who had been in New York. He'd been a great friend of Franz Klein, and he was scheduled to talk at the Asian Academy. And Alan Watts, who was then the dean, telephoned to me and said, "A Japanese painter's arriving and he's going to stay for a week, and would I look after him?" And the next day I met Hasegawa and I took him for a walk in Muir Woods. And we walked for 2 hours. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. When we came back, I said, "Would you like to go and have some lunch in my house, or would you like to go to my studio?" And Hasegawa said, "I'd like to go to your studio," which was on board a ferry boat, on board a ferry boat at that time. So when we got on board, he looked around, and looked at the floor and everything, and he indicated that he would like to do some calligraphy. And he started clearing the junk away and prepared a beautiful little place. And then he made a few characters. He made the character for infinity. And we had a wonderful session. He wrote the Japanese alphabet, and it was a memorable occasion. And we had tea. And he had a little 3/4 size tea ceremony kit, which was called a mountain water tea ceremony kit, one to take on picnics. Mountain water, I believe, means landscape.
There's a line behind me from a Chinese poem, and it says, literally, day, ditto. In other words, day, day, that is good day. Every day is a good day. And it comes as the last line of this poem. In spring, hundreds of flowers. In summer, refreshing breeze. In autumn, the moon. Free your mind from idle thoughts, and for you, every season is a good season, or every day is a good day. And idle thoughts mean illusory thoughts, thoughts of pursuing a future, thoughts of making one's happiness depend on something which isn't here at all. And so, when in civilized societies we spend so much of our time living for the future, we become very much like those celebrated donkeys, you know, that have a carrot fastened on a stick that's tied to the neck, you know, behind here, and it comes over, and there's the carrot dangling in front of them. And they pursue it, but can never reach it. And so in exactly the same way, it's that way with us. My goodness, don't you remember when you went first to school? And you went to kindergarten. And in kindergarten, the idea was to push along so that you could get into first grade, and then push along so that you could get into second grade, third grade, and so on, going up and up. And then you went to high school, and this was a great transition in life. And now the pressure is being put on. You must get ahead. You must go up the grades and finally be good enough to get to college. And then when you get to college, you're still going step by step, up to the great moment in which you're ready to go out into the world. And then when you get out into this famous world comes the struggle for success in profession or business. And again, there seems to be a ladder before you, something for which you're reaching all the time. And then, suddenly, when you're about 40 or 45 years old in the middle of life, you wake up one day and say, huh? I've arrived. And by Jove, I feel pretty much the same as I've always felt. In fact, I'm not so sure that I don't feel a little bit cheated. Because, you see, you were fooled. You were always living for somewhere where you aren't. And while, as I said, it is of tremendous use for us to be able to look ahead in this way and to plan, there is no use planning for a future, which when you get to it and it becomes a present, you won't be there. You'll be living in some other future which hasn't yet arrived. And so in this way, one is never able actually to inherit and enjoy the fruits of one's action. You can't live at all unless you can live fully now.
This is Japan, a country in which man and nature have learned to grow together in harmony, where houses don't stand out like sore thumbs, and where the land is loved and carefully farmed, where a cooperation between man and nature has been achieved, which is very largely the result of a form of Buddhism known in Japan as Zen. A form of Buddhism which is really a blend between the Buddhism of India and the Taoist philosophy of China. The latter particularly emphasizing the fact that man is a part of nature, and instead of trying to conquer nature, must cooperate. It is absolutely fundamental in Buddhism to allow oneself to flow with the stream of life. Really, there's no way of preventing it. And trying to prevent it is like trying to swim against an overwhelmingly powerful current. That way one drowns. But by flowing with it, one ceases to waste energy resisting it, and all that energy is available as new energy for creative work in art and life. A Zen poem says, the waters before and the waters after, now and forever flowing, follow each other. It's basic to Chinese philosophy that death is part of life, just as space goes with solids. To resist death, to resist change, to resist transience is to resist life itself. And to come to the feeling as a result of this resistance that you, as a human being, are in some way separate from life, that you don't belong in the universe, that you don't express its fundamental energy as waves express the existence of the water. Through Zen Buddhism, man has learned to cooperate with nature. There enters into it discipline and hard work. But this hard work is, as it were, flowing with the stream, cutting the wood with the grain, developing nature in the directions along which nature is already going. When I use the word mysticism, I'm referring to a kind of experience, a kind of, shall we say, state of consciousness, which seems to be as prevalent among human beings as measles. It's something that simply happens, and we don't know why it happens, and although there are all sorts of techniques which claim to be able to promote it, and which are more or less successful in doing so, and sometimes rather less than more, nevertheless there is this peculiar thing that happens to people. And it's been recorded as far back in time as we have any recording at all. And that is coming over people the peculiarly convincing sensation that their ordinary sense of individuality, of personal identity, is transcended. And the individual suddenly feels an experience that actually it could be described from a number of quite different points of view. But we could add up these dominant characteristics. That instead of the ordinary feeling that I as an individual confront a world that is foreign to me, that is not me, in this kind of experience I find myself to be of one and the same nature or identity as the world outside me. In other words, I suddenly feel no longer a stranger in the world, but as if the external world were my own body. Now, of course, everything is fundamentally in harmony with the Tao. In the book called the Zhongyong, or the Unwobbling Pivot, it is said, the Tao is that from which nothing can depart. That from which things can depart is not the Tao. Fundamentally, you see, you can't get away from it. It's a situation in which we are all floating in a tremendous river, and the river carries you along. Now, some of the people in the river are swimming against it, but they're still being carried along. Others have learned that the art of the thing is to swim with it, and they're carried along too, but they know it.
And so in this way, to a person who really wakes up, you very soon realize that your existence is not something that is just the hopeless little creature that's suddenly confronted with a great big external world that goes gah at him, and eats him up. Every tiniest little thing that comes into being, every minute little fruit fly or gnat or bacterium, I will go so far as to say is an event upon which this whole cosmos depends. This universe consists of an arrangement of pattern in which every event is essential to the whole thing. Now, we screen that idea out of our consciousness in exactly the same way that we screen out the perception of space as an important reality. Just as we pay attention to the figure and ignore the background, so we see one way of looking at things, mainly that the organism is very frail against the environment. It lasts a long time, the environment, but the organism only lasts a short time. And yet there is the environment just as the same way as there is the face in the newspaper photograph behind all those little dots. When you get far enough away from it, you see the face. When you get far enough away from all the organisms and the little bits of things, you see the environment. This is Alan Watts speaking, and I'm this evening on my ferry boat the host to a fascinating party sponsored by the San Francisco Oracle, which is our new underground paper. And we have here Alan Cohen representing the paper, the Oracle. We have Allen Ginsberg, poet and rabbinic sadhu. We have Timothy Leary, about whom nothing needs to be said, and Gary Snyder, also poet, Zen monk, and old friend of many years. Well, I think that thus far the genius of this kind of underground that we're talking about is that it has no leadership. The Western world has labored for many, many centuries under a monarchical conception of the universe, where God is the boss, and political systems and all kinds of law have been based on this model of the universe, that nature is run by a boss. If you take the organic view of the world, they would say, for example, that the human body is an organization in which there is no boss. It is a situation of order resulting from mutual interrelationship of all the parts. And what we need to realize is that there can be, shall we say, a movement, a stirring among people, which can be organically designed instead of politically designed. Do you remember the Great Depression when one day everybody was doing business and things were going along pretty well, and the next day there were bread lines? It was like someone came to work and they said to him, "Sorry, chum, but you can't build today. No building can go on. We don't have enough inches." He said, "What do you mean we don't have enough inches? We got wood, haven't we? We got metal, we even got tape measures." He said, "Yeah, but you don't understand the business world. We just haven't got enough inches, just plain inches. We've used too much of them." And that's exactly what happened when we had the Depression. Because money is something of the same order of reality as inches, grams, meters, pounds, or lines of latitude and longitude. It is an abstraction. It is a method of bookkeeping to obviate the cumbersome procedures of barter. But our culture is entirely hung up on the notion that money has an independent reality of its own. And this is a very striking, concrete example of what I'm going to talk about, of the way we are bamboozled by our thoughts, which are symbols, and what we can do to become unbamboozled. Another example of this fantastic confusion is that not so long ago, the Congress voted a law imposing stern penalties upon anyone who should presume to burn the American flag. And they put this law through with a great deal of patriotic oratory and quoting of poems and so on about Old Glory, ignoring the fact entirely that these same congressmen, by acts of commission or omission, are burning up that for which the flag stands. They are allowing the utter pollution of our waters, of our atmosphere, the devastation of our forests. But you see, they don't notice the difference between the flag and the country. Or as Korzybski pointed out, the difference between the map and the territory. Compare a physical globe and a political globe. The physical globe is a pretty thing with all kinds of green and brown, wiggly patterns on it. The political globe, on the other hand, has still got the wiggly outlines of the land, but they are all crossed over with colored patches, many of which have completely straight edges. A lot of the boundary between the United States and Canada, once you get west of the Great Lakes, is simply a straight line. It is absolutely a violation of the surface of the territory. And look at the fair city of San Francisco. It's a lovely place, but they planted on the hills of San Francisco a city pattern that was appropriate for the plains of Kansas, a gridiron. And so you get streets that go straight up and that are extremely dangerous, where they should have followed the contours of the hills. And so we put ourselves in boxes. Everything is put in boxes. But actually, everything else in nature doesn't go that way. As, for example, the snail doesn't put itself in a box. The crab doesn't put itself in a box. It has these fascinating, gorgeous objects. What is, for example, more beautiful than a conch shell or a lovely scallop shell? Well, these are gorgeous things. We could make the most delicious shells out of concrete or plastics. They could be very beautiful. And we could distribute ourselves over the landscape like shellfish along the seashore. But instead we have to live in boxes. And there's nothing, you can't fight it, it's the system. So, then you have to, you begin to build your furniture and chairs, everything, accordingly to these shapes, because they're easy to store away in a place that is a box in the first place.
A person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts. So he loses touch with reality and lives in a world of illusions. By thoughts, I mean specifically chatter in the skull, perpetual and compulsive repetition of words, of reckoning and calculating. I'm not saying that thinking is bad. Like everything else, it's useful in moderation. A good servant, but a bad master. And all so-called civilized peoples have increasingly become crazy and self-destructive because through excessive thinking they have lost touch with reality. Most of us would have rather money than tangible wealth, and a great occasion is somehow spoiled for us unless photographed. And to read about it the next day in the newspaper is oddly more fun for us than the original event. This is a disaster. To get in touch with reality, there is an art of meditation, of what is called yoga or jhana in India, Chan in China, and Zen in Japan. It is the art of temporarily silencing the mind, of stopping the chatter in the skull.
Our minds have to be silent some of the time if we are really to have anything to think about except thoughts. Just let your mind alone and stop trying to make sense of the world.
If you were in a flying saucer from Mars or somewhere and you try and make out what was living on this world, you would see these great ganglia with tentacles going out all over the place. And early in the morning, you see little blobs of luminous particles going into the middle of them, see? And then in the late afternoon or early evening, it would spit them all out again. And they'd say, well, this thing breathes. And it does it in a special rhythm. It goes in and out, in and out, in and out once every 24 hours. But then it rests a day and doesn't spit so much. It spits in a different way. That's a kind of irregularity, and then it starts spitting all over again the same way. Well, I say that's very interesting. That's this kind of thing we have. See? This is something that goes this way.
Welcome to my home. We're aboard the ferry boat Vallejo, which is tied up at the north end of Sausalito, close to San Francisco. And this is where I live. And you may think this place is rather weird. But that's because I've always loved weird things. I remember when I was a little boy, people used to say to me, "Alan, you're so weird. Why can't you be like other people?" Well, I thought that was just plain dull, like having the same thing for dinner every day. And as is well said, variety is the spice of life. So you will indeed find this place rather strange. And some of the things that are weird because they are just obvious and nobody ever thinks of them. Some of the most fascinating scientific discoveries have been made by people who called ordinary common sense in question. Like anybody can see that the Earth is flat, and people know it's flat.
And calling that fundamental assumption in question is really the beginning of geography. So the course of time is really very much like the course of a ship in the ocean. Because here's the ship, you see, and it leaves behind it a wake. And the wake fades out. And that tells us where the ship has been, in just the same way as the past and our memory of the past tells us what we have done. But as we go back into the past, and we go back and back to prehistory, and we use all kinds of instruments and scientific methods for detecting what happened, we eventually reach a point where all record of the past fades away in just the same way as the wake of the ship. Now, the important thing to remember in this illustration is that the wake doesn't drive the ship any more than the tail wags the dog. So therefore, in this way, you experience, if you experience this, a curious liberation from what the Hindus and the Buddhists call karma. The word karma in Sanskrit actually means doing, action. Karma comes from the root, kri, which simply means to do. And so when something happens to me, say I have an accident or an illness, and a Buddhist or a Hindu will say, well, it was your karma. In other words, the implication is you had done something wrong in the past as a result of which you reap this unfortunate consequence in a later time. And that's not the real meaning of karma. Karma does not mean cause and effect. It simply means doing. That, in other words, you are doing what happens to you. And that, of course, depends upon how you define the word you. For example, we were talking about breathing. Am I doing it or is it happening to me? You can look at it either way. I am growing my hair. Am I doing it or is it happening to me? You can look at it either way. All right, I am being sick. I'm being destroyed in an accident. If I define myself as the whole field of events, we'll say the organism-environment field, which is the real me, then all the things that happen to me may be called my doing. And that is the real sense of karma. But when we speak about freedom from karma, freedom from being the puppet of the past, that simply involves a change in your thinking. It involves, in other words, you're getting rid of the habit of thought whereby you define yourself as the result of what has gone before, and instead get into the more plausible and more reasonable habit of thought, in terms of which you don't define yourself in terms of what you've done before, but in terms of what you're doing now. And that is liberation from the ridiculous situation of being a dog wagged by its tail.
Well, I'm taking some time with my quiet friend. Well, I'm taking some time on my own. Well, I'm making some plans for my getaway. The big blue sky shining way up above. Well, I'm cloud-headed. Well, I'm cloud-headed. Well, I'm cloud-headed.
I'm not a guru. I'm simply somebody who enjoys talking about what I think. The philosopher is a lover of wisdom. And I like to talk. Ever since I was a tiny boy, I loved to talk. So I've been talking ever since. I remember once I was looking in the open air and one of those glorious little thistledown things came, and I picked it up like that and brought it down, and it looked as if it was struggling to get away, just as if you caught an insect by one leg, like a daddy long legs or something of that kind. It seemed to be struggling to get away, and I thought, well, it's not doing that. That's just the wind blowing. But then I thought again, really? Only the wind blowing? Surely it is the structure of this thing which, in cooperation with the existence of wind, enables it to move like an animal, but using the wind's effort, not its own. It is more intelligent being than an insect, in a way, because an insect uses effort. Like a person who rows a boat uses effort, but the man who puts up a sail is using magic. He lets nature do it for him with the intelligence to use a sail, you see? Now that is the most highly skillful art of all. That is Taoism in perfection, the art of sailing. Very intelligent. You sitting in this room, you think you're really here. Why, you've persuaded yourself that way. You've acted it so damn well that you know this is the real world. But you're playing it. We haven't realized that life and death, black and white, good and evil, being and non-being, come from the same center. They imply each other. Let's suppose that you were able every night to dream any dream you wanted to dream. And that you could, for example, have the power within one night to dream 75 years of time. And you would naturally, as you began on this adventure of dreams, you would fulfill all your wishes. You would have every kind of pleasure you could conceive. And after several nights of 75 years of total pleasure each, you would say, now let's have a surprise. Let's have a dream which isn't under control. You would get more and more adventurous, and you would make further and further out gambles as to what you would dream. And finally, you would dream where you are now.
We use the word reproduction when we talk about the biological reproduction of the species. And when we talk about the Tibetan so-called prayer wheel, to all Westerners the supreme symbol of superstition. Just let it go round and it says the prayers for you, and you don't have to do any work about it at all. And here it goes. But what's fascinating about it? Any child would like to do this. Just keep it moving. In the same way, any child likes to do this. Swing it around. It's curious. It doesn't form a perfect circle because you have to make your hand go whoop, 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 whoop. And so its path is an ellipse. It's the same as the path of the Earth around the sun. It just swings. It goes around and around and around and around. An orange on the end of a string. What's the fascination of it? Why does one like to do this and just keep it up? You know, I'm sort of stuck with it right now, and I can hardly let go of it. No, I'm supposed to go on with this program, but I'm so fascinated with spinning this orange on the end of a string that I don't know if I'm going to make it. Why do we like to do that? We'll play music. We'll dance.
When I was a boy in London, I used to love to visit the British Museum. And in the neighborhood of the museum, there are a number of old shops, some of them I think dating from the end of the 18th century. And on the inscription over the shop window, it said that they sold philosophical instruments. And I couldn't for the life of me make out what philosophical instruments could be, because I thought philosophers were people who simply sat thinking and wouldn't have any need for any special instruments. But when I went up to these shops, I found that what they had in the window were telescopes, slide rules, chronometers, and all sorts of what we would now call scientific instruments. Because you see, the original name for science was natural philosophy. Because a philosopher is a person who is curious about everything. He's not only curious about theoretical matters, but he's also curious about what we should now call practical matters. And I regard myself as a philosopher in exactly that sense. Because aside from being interested in changed states of consciousness, in problems of death, problems of time and space, and the practice of meditation, I'm also interested in what you would call down-to-earth things, such as food, clothing, housing, problems of ecology and population, because all this is part of natural curiosity or philosophy.
It's astonishing. All this is only 20 or 30 minutes from the heart of San Francisco. Not a human habitation in sight anywhere. I've been living out here for some months to write and to absorb an atmosphere that is different from the city, to try and find out what is the essential difference between the world of nature and the world of man. But I am part of all this. I am, as it were, one of the cells in this tremendous brain, which I can't understand, because the part cannot comprehend the whole. And yet at the same time, I don't feel, like so many people seem to feel, that I'm a foreigner or a stranger in this world. Its aesthetic forms somehow appeal to me more than most of the aesthetic forms which men have produced. I feel in it as if, in the same way when you see a flower in a field, it's really the whole field that is flowering, because the flower couldn't exist in that particular place without the special surroundings of the field that it has. You only find flowers in surroundings which will support them. So in the same way, you only find human beings on a planet of this kind, with an atmosphere of this kind, with temperature of this kind, supplied by a convenient neighboring star. And so, just as the flower is a flowering of the field, I feel myself as a personing, a manning, a peopling of the whole universe. In other words, I seem, like everything else, to be a center, a sort of vortex at which the whole energy of the universe realizes itself, comes alive, a sort of aperture through which the whole universe is conscious of itself. I've just come back from Los Angeles. I was down there to meet with a group of rather important people, people in the movie industry, scientists and so on, who were considering calling a congress of the best minds in the world to meet in Los Angeles in the near future, to be a kind of planetary alarm conference. They wanted scientists and statesmen, religious leaders, and to do something to impress upon the world through all the media that we are in very serious danger of destroying the biosphere, that is to say, the whole envelope of living creatures which covers this planet, through pollution, overpopulation, nuclear fallout, poisoning of our food, and very lack of food. And we met to discuss the problem of organizing this conference, and here were all these brilliant people. And it came over us that we really didn't know what we ought to say. I mean, you can scream and create a state of panic, but that won't do any good. And when it came down to it, we didn't know what we ought to say because we really don't know what to do. Some things that we might do, for example, to increase the food supply with high-yield crops, may be ecological mistakes. And so the consensus of almost everybody at the meeting was that in some way or other, the human race has to learn how to leave the world alone and let what is called the natural homeostasis, that is the self-balancing process of nature, take care of the mess. Now, how are we going to do that? This is Japanese ceremonial tea. It's good on a cold day. See, our problem is we don't really know how to stop. We've got something started and we see it's going in a wrong direction. And I think the difficulty is, to borrow an old Chinese saying, that when the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. In other words, there's something wrong with the way we think. And while that is there, everything we do will be a mess. Now, what is it that's wrong? Now, as far as I can see, the basic mistake is that we've invented this wonderful system of language and calculation, and that it is at once too simple to deal with the complexity of the world, and also we are liable to confuse that system of symbols with the world itself, just as we confuse, say, money with wealth. A lot of people are in business to make money instead of wealth. When they make the money, they don't know what to do with it. And so in the same way, we confuse happiness with status, and we confuse ourselves as living organisms, which are one with this whole universe, with something we call our personality. Now, what is our personality? Our personality is what we call our image of ourselves, and also our thought about ourselves, our idea of ourselves. This is the person. In other words, what people meet and understand, and what I understand as Alan Watts, is a big act which is not really me. Because in the image of Alan Watts, there are not all my unconscious processes, both psychological and physical. The construction of my brain is not contained in the concept Alan Watts, and the concept Alan Watts does not contain the inseparable relationships which I have with all the rest of the universe. And therefore that concept is a fraud. And when it's mistaken for the real me, there's a confusion, because If somebody says to me, Alan Watts, do something about it, the concept Alan Watts can't do anything. In other words, because it's only a concept, you can't make it lift a weight, just as 3 is a concept. 3, the number. You can't make just plain 3 do anything. So also you can't wrap up parcels with the equator. It's a useful imaginary line, but it can't do anything. But we all feel that this concept of ourselves, which we call our personality or our ego, can do something, because we think it really exists. And I'll tell you why we think it exists. What happens when you, if I were to say to you, now look hard at the television screen, really look at it. What do you do as distinct from just watching it in the ordinary way when you say, now I really got to see that? What do? Notice that you tighten muscles all around here, that you frown a little, you clench your teeth perhaps. Now what has that got to do with seeing anything clearly? It has absolutely nothing to do with it. Same thing when you listen carefully. Now listen, catch everything that's said, or you start tightening up around your ears. That has nothing to do with hearing clearly. Now from the moment we were little children, when teachers in class screamed at us, pay attention, we go tight in various ways, either to see or hear more clearly, to concentrate, or to will something which is supposed to be difficult to do. And that constitutes a habitual tension over the whole body that's there almost all the time. And that feeling of unnecessary tension is, as it were, the material sensation upon which we fasten this concept of I. We hang it on to that feeling. The concept is not us. The feeling of tension is completely phony. It has nothing to do with success in seeing, hearing, or acting. And so we get the marriage of an illusion with a falsehood, and that we call ourselves. And no wonder we feel cut off from everything, alienated, frightened of life and death. So what has to happen is we have to come back to a sane view of our own life, which is the way we really are, an organism functioning in terms of the whole environment, with the whole environment, instead of this funny little separate personality. But how are we going to do that? People say, oh, you can't change human nature overnight. You're asking us to give up the ego. And that's the most difficult of all things to do. Actually, it isn't, because the ego doesn't exist. But of course, if you try to give up your ego with your ego, then it'll take you to the end of time. Because this is the point. You can't transform yourself. You can't make yourself sane. You can't make yourself loving. You can't make yourself unselfish. And yet it's absolutely necessary that we be that way. It's absolutely necessary. If we are going to hand over the direction of nature to nature, which is what it comes to, it's absolutely necessary that we let go of ourselves, and it can't be done. Not by anything that we call doing it, acting, willing, or even just accepting things. You can't do it. Why? Because you don't really exist as that kind of a separate ego or personality. It's just an idea based on a phony feeling. So when it comes down to it, it's shocking news for us, for the human race, for our pride. You're only making a mess by trying to put things straight. You're trying to straighten out a wiggly world, and no wonder you're in trouble. So you can't do anything. So you can't transform yourself. And what can you do? What happens then if you actually realize you've come to a dead end? And the human race has come to a dead end, in my opinion. What then? Commit suicide? Or is there something else? What happens when you just wait? There's nothing you can do. You watch. And all you see is what goes on that is happening of itself. You're breathing, the wind is blowing, the trees are waving, your blood is circulating, your nerves are tingling. It's all going on of itself. But do you know, that's you. That's the real you. The you that goes on of itself. It's not the symbol. It's not the person. It's you that's happening, as when you breathe. Yes, you can get the feeling that I am breathing by shoving your breath, but your breath goes on day in and day out without your doing anything about it or even thinking of it. The same way your brain is functioning without your forcing it. So when you come to a dead end, and we are individually and socially now in 1971 at a dead end, this is the moment of which it is said man's extremity is God's opportunity, because we have to stop. And when we stop, we find a world that is happening rather than being done, being shoved. And that happening, as distinct from doing, is our fundamental self. And our fundamental self is not something just inside the skin. It's everything around us with which we connect. When you look out of your eyes at nature happening out there, you're looking at you. I'm not going to say what we should do from then on, but simply that before we think of doing anything in this critical situation, we realize the completely illusory nature of the beings that we think we are, and get back again to the beings that we really are, which includes all this outside world, no longer left outside.
It was as a result of looking at paintings like this that I first became interested in Eastern philosophy. That was many years ago, when I was a boy, only about 14 years old. And the thing that grasped me and excited me about this vision of the world was the astonishing sympathy and feeling for the world of nature. Think, for example, of a painting like this, which is called Mountain After Rain. A painting by the Chinese artist Gao Kogun, showing the mist and clouds drifting away after a wet night of pouring rain. And it's fascinating for us to think that pictures of this kind are not what we would call just landscape paintings. They are also icons. That is to say, they are a religious and philosophical kind of painting. Painting is perhaps a little closer to the real world than talking. If I wanted to show you, for example, how to do something rather complex like tying a knot, it would be very difficult to explain in so many words how that knot is to be tied. But in an instant I can show you. And in this way, a picture shows us far more than words ever can. And so it's closer to nature. Now, what happens when the same thing is done in writing? The formal character of writing gives way to a purely spontaneous way of writing in what is called grass style. Here's a poem which says, "The morning dawns, but the dusky night follows soon. So is life like a crystal drop of dew. Unconcerned, The morning glory goes on, blooming, blooming, its short yet full life.
The animal probably doesn't concern itself very much with problems of future disease, death, or starvation, and things of that kind. If an animal sees another dead animal lying around, I don't suppose he thinks to himself, well, one day that's going to happen to me. Rather, he just sees a dead animal, sniffs it, sees whether it's good to eat, and wanders away. But for human beings, it's entirely different, because we actually spend most of our time and a great deal of our emotional energy living in time which is not here, living in an elsewhere which is not concretely real. So much so that although we may be quite comfortable and happy in our present circumstances, if there is not a guarantee, not a promise of a good time coming tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, we are at once unhappy, even in the midst of pleasure and affluence. And so we develop a kind of chronic anxiety about time. We want to be sure more and more, because of our sensitivity to the feeling of time, we want to be sure more and more that our future is assured. And for this reason, the future becomes of more importance to most human beings than the present. And in this sense, we are hooked, taken in by a maya, because it is of very little use to us to be able to control and plan the future unless we are capable at the same time of living totally in the present.
The organization of human life, its systems of communication and systems of control are extended more and more and more in just the same way, for example, that by assimilating the minerals out of the soil and the rays out of the sunlight, a plant like a fern grows and grows and grows and extends its form. And in this way, its organization prevails. Now then, you see, if you take this task of what we call the conquest of nature, the task of making order victorious over chaos or randomness, if you take this seriously, you will look upon it as warfare. And you will firmly believe that the most urgent thing that there possibly can be is to make order prevail over randomness, to make good prevail over evil, to make life prevail over death. And we find that when we are in a contest of this kind, a serious warfare game of this kind, and we take it seriously, we are involved in it in a very deep and bitter sense. Now, the difference of Buddhism from science as a form of knowledge is that in Buddhism it would be said that this view of things, this view of the task of life as making order triumph over disorder, leaves something out. You remember right at the beginning I made some importance of a Sanskrit word which is fundamental in Buddhism, avidya. Avidya, which meant a means non, vidya, knowing. Non-knowing or ignorance, or better, ignorance. Ignorance, in other words, leaving something out of account. And I want to use a familiar illustration to show in what way we ignore. You see here a figure which is apparently, as you look at it, two faces in profile about to kiss each other. Now, if we draw back a little from those two faces, we can see on the white area in between them the form of a cup.
But the interesting thing about this is that as you look at it, you will either be able to see the form of the cup or the form of the two faces in profile, as it were, about to kiss each other. You can alternate them between them very rapidly, but you will not be able to see them both that way at the same time. In other words, either the white must be the background and the black the figure on the ground, or else the black must be the background and the white cup showing up on it. And so in this way, we are unable to see really, we can think it. After a while we can get accustomed to the idea that the figure and the ground, the black and the white, are mutually necessary to each other. In that figure that I showed you, you could say both the cup with the stem and the two faces are there. But our ideas about them, our concepts, are mutually exclusive, and we cannot see them both at the same time. And in the same way, in this figure that I drew, we either see the sawn-off stumps or the bear claws. It's difficult to see this figure both ways at the same time. And so, also, just as we see one and not the other, so we identify ourselves. After all, when you're looking at the white figure in that illustration, which is the cup, you, as it were, identify with the cup. When you look at the two faces, you identify with the profile. So in the same way, when we experience the world around us, we identify with the subject, the knower. We don't identify with what we see. But as a matter of fact, if there is nothing seen, there is no experience of a seer. If there is no seer, there is no experience of anything seen. They both go together in the same way as the black and the white. And this idea that the yes and the no, the black and the white, the inside of a class, say we draw a square as representing fundamentally the idea of class. I can't have a square which doesn't have both inside and outside. They go together. And in Buddhism, this going together is called shunya. Although this is often translated void, it means that the inside of the square cannot exist, is void without the outside, the subject without the object, the black without the white. And this, of course, is represented in this fundamental Chinese figure of the yang, or the positive principle, and the yin, or the negative principle, like two fishes, constantly circulating, going round and round and round and round in the alternations of life. Now, the question is, are these two fishes involved in a fight? Is the white one eating up the black one, and the black one trying to eat up the white one? If that is the situation, then, of course, life is fundamentally nothing but a grim contest. If this one up here is the good fellow and this one is the bad fellow, if this is order and this is chaos, then a fight goes on between them. And that's largely the way in which our technology has interpreted man's situation as against nature. This is man, the white, the good fellow. This is nature, the dark, the bad fellow. And the white one has got to eat him up. But what happens if the white fish succeeds in eating up the dark fish? The white fish disappears as well as the dark one, because the white one is only there in relation to the dark. So then, if these two fishes, as it were, wake up, if this one wakes up and this one wakes up, which is called awakening in Buddhism, they realize they're one. In other words, they go together. They're inseparable from each other. And this realization is that experience, which is called in Zen Satori, or in Buddhism, Bodhi, awakening. This sudden dawning on our consciousness that life is not really a contest to make yes triumph over no, to make the positive triumph over the negative. The two sides go together. And then one sees, in this strange way, that underlying all that is negative in the world, all that is in a way painful and evil,
there is a kind of necessity to it. It goes with the good. It is necessary for the good. Disorder is necessary for the manifestation of order, just as you must have, say, a black background to show up a light figure. And then when one sees that, a profound transformation takes place in one's attitude to the world. That is to say, instead of looking upon life as a contest, it becomes a dance, it becomes a game. One doesn't withdraw from it, one doesn't stop living, but one goes into the game so that these revolving fishes are no longer trying to eat each other, but they're just going around dancing, having the biggest fun in the world. So then, must we have fixed in our minds the idea that all the forms and patterns of nature are simply methods of attack or defense, that they're devices for camouflage, that they're simply lures for sexual attraction or other utilitarian purposes? Or can we see in them a dance, a joyous cosmology?
I've been talking about the perception of the world coming suddenly out of nothing. You'll remember that in a previous talk, I asked you to close your eyes and listen. And you would hear silence and then sounds coming right out of that silence. And then I suggested that you use your eyes and see light, shape, form, coming at you as a vibration that is proceeding out of space. And I pointed out that our logic resists that because we say you can't get something out of nothing, and that we normally think of all the energetic manifestations of this universe as coming out of the past. We think the things that were there already are producing the things that are going on now. But I was trying to get you to look at it in the other way, so that you would see the whole world starting now instead of in the past, and the past as a kind of echo, fading away into memory, and I illustrated it as being like the wake of a ship that trails across the water and then fades out. But the wake is started by the ship in the present. And so in the same way, I'm moving on to the uncommonsensical idea of the world as a production of energy that is beginning right now and is coming out of the nothing that we variously call space and silence. But then, naturally, this raises the question, how on earth could that happen? And it has been, of course, the usual explanation that the world is being created by God. In Christian and Catholic theology, it is said that God creates the world out of nothing. And I want to emphasize the point, in all fairness to Catholic and to Islamic and to Jewish doctrine, that it doesn't merely teach that God once upon a time started the world and set it going like you would wind up a machine and then leave it alone. All these three religions teach that God is always creating the world out of nothing now and willing it by his divine energy into being at this moment. But now the difficulty for us all, I think, especially for educated people in the modern world, is that the old-fashioned idea of God has become incredible or implausible. That is to say, in church or in synagogue, we seem to be addressing a royal personage. The layout of a church or of a synagogue looks like a royal court. There is some sort of throne, and we address prayers and requests to the being represented by the altar or the throne or the tabernacle, as if that being were a king and were causing this universe in his royal, omnipotent, and omniscient wisdom. But then when we take a look through our telescopes and microscopes, or even when we go out in the forest and look at nature, we have a problem. Because the idea of God that we get from the Holy Scriptures, the Bible, the Quran, doesn't quite seem to fit the sort of world around us that we see, in just the same way as you wouldn't dream of ascribing a composition by Stravinsky to Bach. The style of God venerated in church, mosque, and synagogue seems completely different from the style of the natural universe. And it's so hard to conceive the author of the one as the author of the other. And furthermore, it strikes most intelligent people that our traditional religious ideas of God are too primitive. It seems impossible to think that this universe could have been authored by the naive idea of God as a sort of old gentleman who lives far above the stars in heaven, seated on a golden throne and adored by legions of angels. That seems a concept almost unworthy of the sort of universe that modern science has revealed to us. In other words, here's a picture of God. A friend of mine, Richard Borst, photographed this in a church just south of Oaxaca in Mexico. And it shows a very primitive Indian Catholic imagination of God the Father wearing a triple crown like the Pope, only he's rather young and handsome. He's not quite the old gray-bearded man, the Ancient of Days, but there is a serious idol, Christian idol, of God the Father Almighty. And so certainly that has become implausible. But also for many people it has become implausible that the root of the universe, which the theologian Paul Tillich calls the ground of being, that the root of the universe can be in some way a person to whom we can relate in just the same way that we relate to other people, and furthermore, a person who cares about us. In the words of Jesus, 5 sparrows are sold for a farthing, but yet not one of them falls to the ground without the Father knowing it. So realize that you are of more value than many sparrows. In other words, God cares a great deal more about you. But it just baffles our imagination that there could be this sort of person who cares about each one of us, who is totally aware of every single thing that we are and that we do, and by virtue of being aware of us, creates us. Of course, one thing that is difficult about the idea is that it's embarrassing. We do not feel comfortable if we are watched all the time by an infinitely intelligent judge. You know how it is in school. When you're a child and you're working at some exercise, and the teacher walks behind your desk and looks what you're doing. Now, even if you like the teacher very much, you feel put off by being watched, and it makes you self-conscious and awkward. And so in the same way, many people opt for atheism because they don't want that uncomfortable feeling that they're being watched all the time. It's awkward. And if I were God, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't want to embarrass my creatures in that way. And so I would leave them alone for a lot of the time. In fact, I've often thought about this whole thing. The kind of God that people worship is, of course, an attempt to imagine an absolutely perfect human being. But it's a very poor attempt. For example, Jesus taught that if somebody sins against you, you forgive him. And his disciples asked, well, how many times do you forgive him? And he said 99 times, which is our way of saying umpteen times. Always forgive somebody who sins against you. But notice that that is required of a saint. A saint is always forgiving, but it's not required of God. God will not forgive you unless you apologize. And you have to grovel on the ground if you've committed what the Catholic Church calls a mortal sin. You've got to come to God in a state of great penitence, and if you don't do that, you are liable to be confined in the dungeons of the court of heaven, commonly known as hell, for always and always and always. Now, I don't think that's a very nice kind of fellow. I mean, you wouldn't invite that sort of God to dinner, because he would embarrass everybody. Everybody would be sitting on the edge of their chair, you know, like this, and God would be looking at you in such a way that you felt you were being seen through and through, that all your awful past, all your falseness and lack of authenticity would be completely perceptible to him. And though he understood it, and though he forgave it, he would nevertheless make you feel absolutely terrible. Well, you just wouldn't want that sort of company at dinner. You may think it's frivolous of me to say this, but don't forget that the pictorial image of God that people have in the backs of their minds, even if you're a very sophisticated philosopher or theologian, that primitive pictorial image has a very strong influence on your feelings about religion, about the universe, and about yourself. So it's just for that reason that the traditional idea of God has become implausible to many people, and that modern Protestant theologians and even some Catholics have been talking recently about the death of God and about the possibility of whether we could have a religionless religion. That is to say, a religion which does not involve belief in God. What, in other words, would become of the gospel of Jesus Christ, if it were shown that Jesus' own belief in God were unnecessary and invalid? What would remain of his teaching, of his ideas about caring for other human beings, about social responsibility, and so on and so forth, if the idea of God simply evaporated? Now, I think that's a pretty wishy-washy kind of religion. I mean, if you're going to say that this life is fundamentally nothing but a pilgrimage from the maternity ward to the crematorium, and that's it, baby, you've had it, I think that indicates a singular lack of imagination. I would like to look at the death of God theology in an entirely different way. I would like to say that what is dead is not God, but an idea of God. A particular conception of God has died in the sense of becoming implausible. And I find this a very good thing. Because, well, it's a principle of Jewish theology and later of Christian theology that it is always a mistake, even a sin, if you want to call it that. And I want to as to the exact meaning of a sin. The Greek word in the New Testament for a sin is amatanin, and that means to miss the point, or as in archery, to miss the mark. And therefore, from the Mosaic Ten Commandments comes the idea that it is a sin, that is to say, a missing of the point, to substitute an idol for God. Now, the picture I just showed you, as I said, is an idol. But those primitive Mexicans, even they don't seriously confuse that particular image with God. The danger of it is, of course, is they may think of God as something like that in their mind's eye. They may think of God in the form of man. But the images that have been made of God or of the gods out of wood and stone and in painting have never really been taken seriously as actually what God is like, and nobody has confused the actual image, say, of a Buddha, such as you saw at the beginning of this program. Buddha is of course never identified with a god, because Buddha is a human being. But these images are never seriously confused with what they represent, any more than a Catholic confuses a crucifix with Jesus Christ. So the images that are pictures, statues, and so forth, are not really very dangerous. The dangerous images of God are those that we make not out of wood and stone, but out of ideas and concepts. You see, an idea is abstract. So St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, defined God as necessary being. He who is necessarily. Now that is a philosophical concept. God is being. But that concept is an idol, because it confuses God with an idea, and because an idea is abstract, it seems something very much more spiritual than an image made of wood or stone. And that's just precisely where it becomes deceptive. Likewise, many people think that the Bible is the authentic Word of God, and therefore they worship the Bible and make it into an idol, disregarding the ironical remark of Jesus to his contemporary Jews, "You search the Scriptures daily, for in them you think you have life." And as St. Paul said later, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And so whatever you put as an image or an idea in the place of God necessarily falsifies God. Now, a lot of people say, I don't think I could face in life. I don't think I could face life unless I could believe in a just and loving God. It strikes me that that kind of belief in God is actually a lack of faith. You see, the word belief in Anglo-Saxon comes from this Anglo-Saxon root leaf. I would as lief. And leaf means to wish. So belief really means a strong wish. When you get up and say the creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and of all things visible and invisible, you are really saying, I fervently wish that there exists a God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, etc. Because if you really have faith, you don't need belief. Because faith is an entirely different attitude from belief. Faith is a state of openness or trust. To have faith is, for example, like when you swim, you trust yourself to the water. You don't grab hold of the water when you swim. And if you go stiff and tight in the water and try to catch hold of it, you'll sink. You have to relax. So in the same way, when a cat falls off a tree, the cat doesn't go stiff all over in a state of tension, that is to say, a state of holding on. The cat relaxes. It falls heavily, thumps the ground with its tail, and isn't hurt because it relaxed. So the attitude of faith is the very opposite of clinging, of holding on. So that you could say that a person who is a fanatic in religion, who simply has to believe in certain propositions about the nature of God and the nature of the universe, is a person who has no faith at all, because he's holding on tight. And so when we sing hymns like Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee, these aren't hymns of faith. Or even Luther made such a thing about faith. But he wrote a hymn in German, Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott, a mighty fortress is our God. That's not a hymn of faith. A person of faith doesn't need a fortress. He's not on the defensive, and so in the same way, when churches are designed like the royal courts of kings, you know, in the royal court, the king sits with his back to the wall, which is the position, or used to be the position of the altar. And around him he would have his courtiers and guards. And their place, of course, in the church design called a basilica, which means the court of a basileus, a king. The bishop sits at the back in his throne, and all his attendant clergy stand around him like his guards in a royal court. Well, why is this? A king stands with his back to the wall because he rules by force. And when his subjects and his courtiers approach him, they prostrate themselves, they kneel down. Why? Because that's a difficult position from which to start a fight. And so, are we projecting the image of a frightened king upon the ground of being the Godhead? We are, you see. Or in a Protestant church, the furniture all looks like a courthouse. The minister wears a black gown, and it's the same black gown as is worn by a judge. And there are pews and pulpits and all the familiar wooden boxes of court furniture. And the minister, like the judge, throws the book at you. He preaches the law laid down in that other idol of God, the Bible. But does God need all that? I mean, is God somebody who takes this aggressive attitude, either of the king in the court where all the subjects must prostrate, or of the judge who bangs the gavel and says, "Baw, baw, 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 baw"? Well, this is ridiculous. And a God so conceived is an idol and manifests the absence of faith of all those who worship him, because they have no attitude of trust. They cling on to these rules, to these conceptions, and have no fundamental give to life. Now, in a certain way, you might say that a good scientist has more faith than a religious person, because a good scientist says, I want to find out what is the case. My mind is open to the truth, whatever that truth may turn out to be. I have no preconceptions. I may have some hypotheses. I may have some notions in my mind as to what the truth might be, but I'm going to test it. And the test is, I will open all my senses to reality and find out what that reality is. But then again, the scientist runs into a problem, because he knows that whatever comes to him as reality depends on the structure of his instruments and the structure of his senses, and behind the structure of his senses, the structure of his brain. And that's himself. So he has to have, back of all that, an act of faith in his own brain, an act of faith in himself that his physical organism, or his mind, or whatever you want to call it, is indeed reliable and will show him reality, truth, what is. So unless there is a basic and primordial act of faith in yourself, and you can't ultimately check on yourself, you have to believe your senses. You have to believe your reason, your logic, your intelligence. So you have to have faith in that, even though you can't check it. I mean, it's not like your mind's a radio and you can go in and screw in a connection here and fix up another connection there, and so be quite sure. You always have to trust. And behind all that, you see, behind the brain, just as I've shown you before, behind your eyes, there's the blank space. The unknown, the unseen. And therefore one could say that the highest image of God, which is the unseen behind the eyes, the intangible and invisible, which is space, out of which come all the stars, we can say, yes, that is God. But we have no image of that. We do not know what that is. But we have to trust it. There's no alternative. There's no way out. You can't help trusting it. You've got to. But you see, that trust in a God whom one cannot conceive in any way is a far higher form of faith than fervent clinging to a God of whom you have a definite conception. And that conception can easily be wrong, and even if it's right, clinging to it would be the wrong attitude, because when you love someone very much, you shouldn't cling to them. I don't want to hug my wife so tightly that I strangle her, and mothers shouldn't love their children so much that they strangle them by smother love. It comes out in the story in the New Testament when Mary Magdalene, who loved Jesus very much, she's said to have seen him after his resurrection, and she immediately ran to cling to him, and he said, "Do not cling to me." It's translated in the King James Bible, "do not touch me," but the Greek word haptin means to cling to. Don't cling to me. Don't cling to anything of the Spirit. It's just like don't cling to water, because the more you grab it, the faster it'll slip through your fingers. Don't cling to your breath. If I breathe in and hold it and say, "Oh, I got this breath now, I better hang on to it because breath is life," I'm going to go purple in the face and strangle. You have to let it go. You let your breath out. That's the act of faith, to breathe out. It'll come back. Actually, the Buddhist word nirvana means breathe out, because letting go is the fundamental attitude of faith. Now, it isn't as if Christians hadn't been aware of this. One of the most fundamental source books of Christian spirituality was written, somewhere in the 5th century, maybe the 6th century, by a Syrian monk who gave himself the name Dionysius. I've recently translated this book. It's called Theologia Mystica, Mystical Theology. And you can get it from your paperback bookstore. This book is a very strange document, because it explains that the highest knowledge of God is through what he calls in Greek agnosia, which means unknowing. He says that one knows God most profoundly and most truly in not knowing God. That means, just in the same way as your sight comes out of an unseen, so when you know that you don't know, you really know. And you really know because knowing that you don't know is a state of mind in which you have let go of your efforts to grasp hold of life with your intellect. We have a saying in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit, which means that out of nothing comes nothing. You can't, in other words, get something out of nothing. And it's occurred to me that this is a fallacy of tremendous proportions that lies at the root of all our common sense, not only in the West, but in many parts of the East as well. Because what has struck me is that nothing, the negative,
the empty, is exceedingly powerful. I would say, not ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing comes nothing, but I would say you can't have something without nothing. We all know that energy is always vibration, pulsation. Whether it be the energy of light or the energy of sound, it's always on and off. So that all wave motion then is this process. And it's curious, isn't it? When we think of waves and talk about waves, we think about the crests. We think about this point. And we say, that is waves. And that is because the crests stand out from the underlying uniform bed of water, which is relatively solid in comparison with the space above, so that these crests are perceived as the things, the forms, the waves. But to have sound, you must have the alternation of sound, silence, sound, silence, sound, silence. And so you get that which you can hear on a very deep note. Now the same thing is true of all life together. We shouldn't really contrast existence with non-existence, because actually existence is the alternation of to be and not to be, of positive and negative, of on and off. So you could say existence is eternal if we are to consider existence as this alternation of now you see it, now you don't, now you see it, now you don't, now you see it, now you don't. It is that contrast that presents the sensation of there being anything at all. Now, in light and sound, these waves are extraordinarily rapid so that we don't hear the interval between them. But there are other circumstances in which the waves are extraordinarily slow, as in the alternation of day and night, light and darkness, and the much vaster alternations of life and death, of the great slow cycles of the world. But these alternations are just as necessary to the being of the universe as in the very fast motions where we get it in light and in sound and in the sense of solid contact, where it's going so rapidly that we notice the continuity, or the is side, and we ignore the intervention of the isn't side. But it's there just the same, just as there are vast spaces within the very heart of the atom. You know, too, how smells are so powerful in evoking memories. Something you smelled as a child. Say, the smell of fresh coffee being cooked early in the morning, or bacon frying, or leaves being burned on an autumn day. All these things evoke very vivid emotions and feelings of our childhood in the past. But you know, when people talk about very deep things, they never talk about the sense of smell. They talk about touch, vision, and even taste and hearing. For example, we hear about the vision of God. In the Catholic Church, it is said that the highest thing to which man can attain, or to which the angels can attain, is the beatific vision, to see God. And the prophets would hear the word of the Lord. And in one of the Psalms it says, "Oh, taste and see how excellent the Lord is." Taste and see. But no one ever had the idea of smelling God, of having not just the beatific vision, but the beatific smell. This has never been brought out. And yet, curiously enough, throughout the whole history of religions, until we got to what is called the phenomenon of the Protestant nose, we've had incense. Hindus use incense, Buddhists use incense, Mohammedans use incense, Catholics
use incense. But there came a break